The blip vanished. On a glowing screen inside a Soviet orbital tracking station, the telemetry from an American satellite, P-78-1, cut out without warning. No power down, no orbit decay, no malfunction report. 1 second it was there, transmitting clean data in its 5555-kilometer low Earth orbit. The next second, gone. Inside the concrete bunker, the lead analyst froze. "Did we lose signal?" someone asked. "No," came the reply. "It's been destroyed." For a moment, no one spoke. P-78-1 wasn't just any satellite. It was an advanced U.S. reconnaissance platform, and nothing should have been able to reach it. Not in that orbit, not that fast, and yet thousands of kilometers below, off the coast of California. An F-15A fighter jet had just climbed into the stratosphere, its nose pointed skyward, and launched something unprecedented, a 3-stage ASM-135 missile. It rose through the thin atmosphere, coasted beyond 300 kilometers, and then released a kinetic kill vehicle that collided with the satellite at over 24,000 kilometers per hour. The United States had just demonstrated it could destroy a satellite in orbit. From a fighter jet, the weapon didn't carry explosives. It didn't need to. The velocity alone vaporized the satellite on contact. Debris began to scatter into orbit. And Soviet scientists, watching from the other side of the Iron Curtain, were hit with a terrifying realization. There was no more sanctuary. Until this moment, space had been a protected domain, dangerous, yes, but untouched by kinetic weapons. Satellites were off limits, too strategic, too fragile, too globally intertwined. But now, the U.S. had just proved they could eliminate one from below, and with precision. The implications were devastating. Every communications link, every spy satellite, every early warning system vulnerable. The Soviet Union had invested billions in orbital infrastructure, thousands of devices in low and geosynchronous orbits, each one vital, and each one, suddenly, targetable. Inside that bunker, the horror wasn't about one satellite. It was about the new battlefield that had just opened, a battlefield without borders, where speed and altitude no longer meant safety, a scientist whispered. They just killed something in orbit. Another replied, "No, they just killed our doctrine. For decades." Soviet scientists believed space was untouchable, not because it was sacred, but because it was too fragile, too strategic, too mutually dependent. Both the USSR and the United States had poured enormous resources into satellites for navigation, communications, reconnaissance, and early warning. A war in space wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. The assumption was simple: no one would risk it. Soviet military doctrine treated space as an extension of strategic observation, not combat. Their satellites were the eyes of the motherland watching oceans for carrier groups, scanning missile silos in Montana, timing launches from submarines. They built redundancy into their networks, multiple satellites for every region, backup communication links. But they didn't build them for war. Not a war like this. Because in Soviet minds, attacking a satellite was too difficult, too expensive, and too provocative, even at the height of Cold War paranoia. The Kremlin believed America would never attempt a direct, kinetic strike on an orbital platform. It would be an act of irreversible escalation, something that would change the rules forever. Besides, how would they even do it? Missiles couldn't reach orbit in time. Lasers were still experimental. Space-to-space interception required co-orbital maneuvering, which took hours or days. The very physics of orbital mechanics seemed to protect satellites by default. And so, they felt safe. They deployed military satellites in predictable orbits. They openly monitored American activity. They depended on near-constant surveillance of NATO movements to maintain reaction time and nuclear readiness. All of it balanced on one fragile equation. If you don't strike our satellites, we won't strike yours. That's why the 1985 test stunned them, not just because the satellite was destroyed, but because it was done cheaply, quickly, and without escalation. A modified fighter jet, a single missile, a target vaporized in space. The assumptions collapsed all at once. Suddenly, their constellation wasn't untouchable, it was vulnerable. The Soviets had prepared for missile defense, for orbital surveillance, even for nuclear war. But they hadn't prepared for this. They had assumed that space warfare would require massive, space-based weapons, but America had skipped the space arms race entirely and fired from Earth instead. It wasn't a warhead that destroyed P-78-1. It was a concept. And the Soviet Union's entire belief system about space had just been burned up like the satellite fragments now spinning silently through the dark. In the 1970s and early 80s, Soviet military doctrine treated space as a platform, not a battlefield. Orbital assets were critical not for offense, but for enabling terrestrial command and control. Satellites supported missile targeting, strategic surveillance, weather prediction, and encrypted communications. Soviet generals referred to these satellites as celestial sentinels. They were eyes and ears, but not fists. Their protection was assumed, not enforced, because space was a shared theater, fragile, predictable, and above all, dangerous to tamper with. Any large-scale destruction in orbit could flood critical zones with debris, blinding not just the enemy but your own assets. So the Soviet model didn't include active defensive satellites. It relied on deterrence. The doctrine was built around three false beliefs: that satellites were too fast and too far to be struck kinetically from Earth, that any act of space aggression would provoke full-scale nuclear escalation, so no one would dare, that orbital superiority would always favor whoever had the most eyes, not the most weapons. To reinforce this, the Soviets built a massive orbital presence, hundreds of satellites across multiple constellations. Some specialized in ocean reconnaissance. Others were tasked with infrared early warning. The crown jewels were the Selena and Oko systems, massive arrays of electronic intelligence, and missile launch detectors. But while they perfected surveillance, they ignored vulnerability. No hardening, no evasion, no rapid replacement protocols, because their doctrine didn't require protection. The battlefield was down on Earth, not up there. Meanwhile, the Americans had quietly taken a different path. They developed quick launch systems, small, modular satellites, flexible, mobile platforms, and most dangerously, they explored the ability to deny space. When the ASM-135 launched from that F-15, it didn't just destroy a satellite, it destroyed Soviet assumptions. It proved that speed and altitude meant nothing if your enemy could strike upward at will. That space was no longer a safe observation deck, but a glass rooftop in a battlefield where one well-aimed punch could collapse the whole structure. For Soviet scientists watching their doctrines unravel, it was a brutal epiphany. They had built an empire of eyes, but no armor. And now they understood the next war wouldn't start in space, but it could be lost there, in a single flash of kinetic energy. September 13th, 1985. Edwards Air Force Base, California. A specially modified F-15A named Celestial Eagle taxis onto the runway. Inside the cockpit, U.S. Air Force Major Wilbert Doug Pearson, Jr. In the belly of his aircraft, what looked like an oversized missile with 3 stages of solid fuel. This was not a weapons test. It was a demonstration of doctrine. The target, the P-78-1 Solwind satellite, an aging American solar observation platform orbiting Earth at an altitude of 555 kilometers, at exactly 38,100 feet. Pearson pulls the F-15 into a near-vertical climb at Mach 1.2. As the aircraft nears its apogee, Pearson flips open the launch controls and triggers the ASM-135 ASAT missile. It detaches, ignites, and begins its rapid ascent, climbing into the void with only one mission: kill the satellite. Minutes later, nearly 300 miles above Earth, the kill vehicle slams into P-78-1 at a closing speed of over 24,000 km/h. No explosive, no warhead, just kinetic impact. From Earth, nothing is seen. But in orbit, a small artificial star disintegrates. Back in the USSR, tracking stations light up with alerts. Orbital debris registers across multiple surveillance nodes. Analysts scramble for explanation. The satellite hadn't decayed. It hadn't failed. It had been hit. And suddenly, the unthinkable became fact. America had weaponized air-to-space combat. The F-15, once a dogfighter, was now a platform capable of reaching out and striking beyond the stratosphere. The event sent shockwaves through Soviet scientific and military circles. The Americans didn't need a space shuttle. They didn't need a massive orbital interceptor. They didn't even need to launch from the ground. Just a fast jet, a precise missile, and the will to change the rules. The implications were immediate and devastating. No satellite was safe, no orbit was guaranteed, and no amount of redundancy could protect a blind spot this massive. For years, the Soviets had believed orbital warfare required space-based weapons, complex rendezvous, energy-intensive maneuvers. But the Americans had skipped the entire game board and fired a bullet into the sky. Not only was it possible, it had already happened, and the entire Soviet orbital doctrine, designed around deterrence, observation, and permanence, was now on fire, spinning in tiny fragments above the Earth. The first impossible event wasn't a war. It was a test. But for Soviet scientists, it felt like a first strike. The first internal report was dismissed. Propaganda, muttered one colonel from the Strategic Rocket Forces. No fighter jet can reach orbit. At the Ministry of Defense, an emergency briefing was called. Satellite telemetry confirmed that P-78-1 had ceased transmission and that orbital debris had been detected. But the idea that a fighter jet, just a plane, had fired the fatal shot, it bordered on science fiction. Engineers from NPO Lavochkin and Baikonur's orbital tracking teams were summoned to validate the event. Their calculations were grim. Impact velocity, trajectory, and debris spread all pointed to a direct hit from below. Not a malfunction or collision, but Moscow couldn't admit it. Not publicly. Not even within the general staff. If the Americans had truly developed a kinetic ASAT weapon, deployable from an aircraft, it would mean that every Soviet satellite, military or civilian, was exposed. Not in theory. In fact, the official response was denial. The Pravda newspaper remained silent. No diplomatic protest was issued. Behind closed doors, however, the Soviet Space Command began to panic. But instead of preparing a response, they built a story that the event was staged, that the test had targeted a satellite already rigged to self-destruct, that the kill vehicle was guided with ground-based tracking, not independent navigation, that the missile had barely reached the edge of space, hardly a real threat to high-priority Soviet assets. They clung to this version because the alternative was too destabilizing. If the F-15 could strike a satellite in low Earth orbit, then U.S. bases in Europe, Alaska, or even Japan could launch aircraft that knocked out Soviet satellites before a nuclear exchange even began. It would leave Moscow blind, deaf, and unable to retaliate in real time. And that wasn't just a threat to military operations. It was a threat to the very logic of deterrence. The Soviet Union had spent decades developing its dead hand system, an automated nuclear command network partially reliant on orbital sensors. The idea that these sensors could be silently disabled in the first hour of a conflict was terrifying. Yet the Ministry of Defense chose silence. They needed time. Time to analyze, to recalibrate, to hope that this was a bluff, that America wouldn't build more, that the test was symbolic, not systemic. But inside Akademgorodok, at the heart of Soviet scientific research, physicists and orbital engineers were already whispering the truth. This was not a demonstration. This was an opening shot. And the silence from Moscow, it wasn't strength. It was fear. In the days following the P-78-1 strike, Soviet think tanks scrambled to contain the psychological fallout. A new narrative was constructed, calculated, plausible, and dangerously wrong. The theory went like this. The ASM-135 wasn't scalable. It was a one-off, a high-stakes publicity stunt designed to score political points in Washington and shake Soviet confidence. A weapon made not for war, but for optics. According to this view, the test wasn't about destroying satellites at scale. It was about flexing muscle for the Reagan administration's Star Wars narrative, strategic defense initiative propaganda. Just another illusion to make Moscow overreact. Soviet intelligence agents echoed this view in their briefings. The Americans are showmen, not strategists. They won't invest in an air-launched satellite killer. It's not cost-effective. Even within the Ministry of General Machine Building, the shadowy agency overseeing space weapon development, many believe the F-15 test was symbolic, not systemic. They argued the system was impractical, too weather-dependent, too dependent on pilot precision, too risky for real-world use. One general reportedly quipped, "If they can hit one satellite with a missile, they'd have to launch 100 to blind us. They don't have 100. It was comforting logic, but it was false, because the Americans didn't need to destroy every satellite. They just needed to target the right ones, early warning sensors, relay satellites, command and control nodes, take out 5, maybe 6. The entire Soviet nuclear response doctrine would be thrown into chaos. Still, the Soviet High Command clung to the wrong theory. They saw the ASM-135 not as the tip of a doctrine, but as an experiment. The idea of a repeatable, deployable, scalable ASAT capability was dismissed. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the U.S. Air Force was already integrating new guidance software, exploring more compact kill vehicles, and mapping optimal launch corridors from NATO air bases. America wasn't posturing, it was iterating. But Soviet strategists, trapped in their own sense of rational warfare, couldn't imagine that the U.S. would normalize orbital destruction. To them, space was too high risk for tactical play. They didn't realize the Americans weren't trying to win the next war. They were trying to end it before the first ICBM ever left its silo, and by believing the ASAT strike was theater. The Soviet Union left its skyward flank completely exposed. When fragments of P-78-1 were tracked tumbling through low Earth orbit, a second false explanation took hold, one born not from arrogance, but desperation. This time, Soviet analysts concluded it wasn't a kinetic hit. It was sabotage. They argued that the satellite had been preloaded with explosive charges or a timed self-destruct system triggered remotely as a part of a staged test. The ASM-135 didn't kill the satellite. It merely reached the vicinity. The actual destruction, they claimed, came from within the satellite itself. To some, this theory made more sense. Why risk an international incident Why waste a missile on a satellite already near decommissioning? Why scatter debris in a valuable orbital band? The idea was seductive, clean, strategic. It also made the Americans look clever, but still bound by the same physical limitations the Soviets respected. A kinetic kill vehicle, they said, would require pinpoint navigation at hypersonic closure speeds. Too unpredictable, too risky, too experimental. So they created a fiction that the real test was a performance, not a capability. One Soviet colonel stated, if they had truly struck it with a missile, they would have made noise about it. They would have demanded fear. Instead, they whisper, that's not a weapon, it's theater, but behind closed doors. US engineers were running simulations, modifying nose cones, enhancing guidance algorithms, conducting suborbital tests with dummy satellites. The Americans were preparing to scale. Meanwhile, the Soviets convinced the ASAT threat was a technological magic trick, failed to respond meaningfully. No new orbital hardening programs were ordered. No satellite dispersion doctrine was enacted. The air defense forces were not retrained for vertical interception models. They assumed America was lying. But in 1986, classified reconnaissance revealed multiple U.S. F-15s equipped with ASAT rails at two separate bases, Edwards and Elmendorf. Live training exercises were documented. Infrared plumes consistent with ASM-135 launches were recorded. Still, Moscow hesitated. The second wrong theory had become policy. And that policy left the Soviet Union exposed to a weapon it had convinced itself didn't exist. For a military built on anticipation, this was doctrinal blindness. Not because the Americans hid the truth, but because the Soviets refused to believe it. For a nation that had placed cosmonauts in orbit and spied on American missile sites from space, the Soviet Union's failure to anticipate the ASM-135 wasn't just shocking, it was humiliating. The KGB and GRU had eyes on U.S. aerospace firms. Satellites monitored every launch pad from Vandenberg to Kennedy. Thousands of pages had been collected on the Strategic Defense Initiative. But none of them predicted this, that a conventional airframe would become a strategic anti-satellite platform. They missed the signs not once, but repeatedly. In 1982, when Lockheed began modifying F-15s under a veiled program contract, Soviet agents reported only flight systems optimization. They assumed it was related to avionics testing, not orbital strike. In 1983, the U.S. launched high-altitude flight tests with dummy payloads. Soviet radar tracked the jets, but failed to realize they were rehearsing suborbital missile trajectories. And by 1984, when guidance trials were underway, with real propulsion stages, Soviet intelligence flagged it merely as aerospace maneuver trials. The truth was, staring them in the face, but their doctrine filtered it out. They had always expected the U.S. to pursue space-to-space weapons, orbital interceptors, robotic satellites, massive lasers deployed from shuttles. It fit their model of escalation, complicated, expensive, slow, but the ASM-135 flipped the model. It was cheap, fast, and adaptable, and it operated outside the Soviet model of orbital warfare. One missile, one pilot, one satellite gone. When Soviet scientists pieced together the data after the P-78-1 test, they realized how badly they'd underestimated the scope. This wasn't a prototype. It was an operational weapon. Worse, it had been in development since 1978, right under their noses. Some GRU analysts had flagged a compartmentalized program dubbed Majestic Eagle, tied to ASAT functions. But the leads were dismissed. It sounded like a code name from science fiction. The full scale of the intelligence failure didn't become clear until 1987, when American budget documents, heavily redacted, confirmed serial production requests for ASAT hardware. By then, the damage was irreversible. Soviet counter-ASAT programs were behind. Their Istrabitel Sputnikov co-orbital system was outdated, too slow to target satellites maneuvering in real time. Laser programs were still experimental, and no system could react in minutes the way a fighter-launched ASM-135 could. The USSR had lost not just the satellite, it had lost the initiative. And in space warfare, that was fatal. The intelligence arms had failed. But more importantly, imagination had failed. What the Soviets didn't fully grasp until it was too late was that the ASM-135 wasn't the beginning of something. It was the middle. By the time the missile destroyed P-78-1 in 1985, the United States had already constructed a multi-tiered system designed not merely to destroy enemy satellites, but to control the domain of space itself. At its core was a new doctrine, space denial. The idea wasn't to dominate space with larger constellations, or even defend U.S. assets more aggressively. It was far more elegant and far more dangerous. If the enemy's eyes could be blinded in the opening minutes of conflict, their missiles, ships, and armies would move in darkness. Space wasn't a separate battlefield anymore. It was the first strike theater. The system wasn't just the missile. It was everything that made the missile invisible, fast, and final. Mobile targeting relays, real-time tracking from ground-based radar stations, an F-15 modified to fire above 35,000 feet on a vertical climb, maximizing altitude and precision. And most importantly, the kill vehicle, designed not to explode, but to strike directly at orbital velocity, shattering satellites with pure kinetic energy. This wasn't Cold War brute force. This was surgical deterrence. While the Soviet Union buried itself in space-based interceptors and robotic hunter-killers, the Americans kept it lean. Air-launched, low-profile, deployable within hours from almost any forward airbase. The true genius of the system was scale. It didn't require dozens of missiles. It required selective destruction. Take out 5 satellites, a key navigation relay, an early warning infrared detector, a transoceanic communication node, a weather satellite critical for missile launch forecasting, a targeting uplink system for long-range bombers, and suddenly, the Soviet war machine would stall mid-motion, no eyes, no comms, no coordination. America's ASAT capability didn't just threaten hardware, it threatened doctrine, because the Soviet military had become dependent on space to function as a unified force. The Americans, by contrast, had trained to fight without it, in case their own satellites were jammed or blinded. This asymmetry was devastating. The ASM-135 was never mass-produced. It didn't need to be. Its existence shifted the strategic balance. It told the Soviets, we can see what you see, we can touch what you depend on, and we can make it disappear before you launch a single missile. In war, control of perception is everything, and with one black missile, launched from one ordinary fighter jet, America seized control of the sky above the sky. It wasn't a war. It wasn't even a skirmish. But in 1985, the Soviet Union experienced a defeat more profound than any battlefield loss, because humiliation doesn't always come in flames. Sometimes it comes in silence when your enemy proves they can unmake your reality, and you can't respond. The ASM-135 test was public, but not theatrical. There was no media spectacle, no grandiose announcement from the White House, no footage released to global audiences. It was quiet, clinical, and devastatingly effective. The Soviets couldn't even counter it in propaganda. They had no footage, no defense, no retaliatory test of their own. They had nothing to show the world, nothing to calm the panic rippling through their scientific and military communities. In underground halls near Kaluga, Soviet officers reviewed orbital trajectories and system vulnerabilities. Entire walls of satellite schematics were covered in red lines, critical, unhardened, exposed. For the first time, they admitted privately if America launched a coordinated ASAT strike during a crisis, half of the Soviet space net could go dark in under 45 minutes. That was not theory. That was defeat. Not a single missile had been fired at them. Not a single soldier crossed a border. And yet, their infrastructure for global warfighting had been compromised by a jet on a training sortie. In response, the USSR rushed to reactivate its long-stalled Istrebitel-Sputnikov project, a co-orbital interceptor first tested in the 1960s. But the system was outdated. It required advanced targeting. It took hours to reach interception windows, and it was ineffective against fast-responding or mobile threats. Worse, no Soviet fighter could match the ASM-135's air-to-space reach. No equivalent system could be mounted without years of re-engineering. Meanwhile, American defense circles leaked nothing. The U.S. didn't need to escalate. It had already proven dominance. The most painful moment came in 1986 at a secret space warfare conference near Baikonur. A senior Soviet general reportedly said if they strike from the sky, and we cannot respond from Earth, then we no longer command the battlefield. We only observe the terms of our defeat. That was the humiliation. Not in defeat, but in irrelevance. A single weapon had made an entire doctrine look absurd. It turned space from the crown jewel of Soviet strategic thought into an open grave for their illusions. And the most crushing realization, the Americans hadn't even aimed that missile at them. It was just a test. By 1987, it became clear inside Soviet command structures that the ASM-135 test had not been an isolated demonstration. It was part of a far broader American shift in how space would be used, controlled, and, if necessary, denied. The entire Soviet military-industrial complex, so long built around the assumption of orbital supremacy, began to fracture under the weight of that realization. The ideological collapse started at the top. For decades, the USSR had prided itself on being the world's first space power. Gagarin, Sputnik, Salyut. Their cosmonauts had become symbols of Soviet progress, science, and prestige. The stars weren't just a frontier, they were a domain the USSR had claimed first. But suddenly, being first meant nothing, because the Americans had been quietly building the tools to dominate the domain, not by presence, but by erasure. And Moscow couldn't catch up. Strategic planners found themselves trapped in obsolete equations. Every Soviet war scenario required unbroken satellite coverage, early warning from Oko, targeting data from Selena. Navigation via Perus, all of it could be rendered useless in minutes. The arms race was no longer about missile counts or tank divisions. It was about how quickly one side could shut down the enemy's awareness. The very thing Soviet doctrine had been built upon mass, scale. Visibility became a liability, and ideologically, that broke them. Because the USSR's strength had always been tied to scale, to redundancy, to overwhelming volumes of steel and fuel. But the ASM-135 proved that precision could overpower presence. That one well-timed shot could undo thousands of rubles and decades of doctrine. Soviet scientists scrambled to develop alternatives, hardening satellites, dispersing constellations, deploying dummy targets to fool tracking systems, but it was reaction, not strategy. And the funding wasn't there. The political will was collapsing. Gorbachev's reforms were diverting resources elsewhere. The space race was over, and now it wasn't just about pride, it was about survival. And they were losing that too. By 1989, the Kremlin quietly shelved further ASAT responses. Internally, the war had already been lost. The American concept of rapid orbital denial was now a permanent feature of strategic planning one. The Soviets could neither match nor deter. In the Cold War's final years, space became a haunted theater for the Soviets. Their greatest achievement had turned into their most fragile weakness. And every satellite they launched was now a target marked not by American aggression, but by American ability. The collapse wasn't triggered by a missile. It was triggered by the awareness that one missile was enough. Decades later, the wreckage still orbits, somewhere above Earth. Small fragments of the P-78-1 satellite struck in 1985 by a missile that changed history continue their silent, endless drift. No sound, no glow, just metal shards gliding through the void, like ashes of a doctrine no longer believed in. To the modern eye, the ASM-135 test is a footnote. But for those who lived inside Soviet command rooms, who watched as their orbital maps went red with vulnerability, it was a seismic shift. Because the missile didn't just destroy a satellite. It shattered an illusion. That space was safe. That deterrence was stable. That observation meant control. Today, satellite warfare is a given. China, India, and Russia have all conducted ASAT tests of their own. Nations now harden or maneuver satellites in anticipation of orbital attack. But the first stone was thrown by an F-15 in the California sky when a kinetic kill vehicle proved that invisibility doesn't protect you in space. The Cold War ended not in fire, but in fracture. And nowhere was that fracture deeper than in orbit where Soviet pride gave way to American precision. The Soviet Union is gone, but its satellites remain ghosts circling the Earth. Remnants of a superpower that believed too late that space could be contested. And somewhere in the archives, there's a still classified memo from a Soviet orbital defense analyst, written in the winter of 1986. It contains just one sentence. They proved they can blind us, and we built our system on sight.